It was early evening. The lights, downtown lights, were just coming on. And it was exciting for me to go to town for the first time. That's when I saw the sign for the first time, no Indians allowed. And so I stopped short. I was 9 years old. I'd reached the age of reason. I knew who I was as a Lakota person. I knew our culture was beautiful, although I didn't know how to express it in those words. I knew that we were good people. My father stopped, of course, because he was holding my hand, and he looked down at me and he said, "Daku, what?" And I pointed to the sign and I said, "Dakue, why?" And of course, he said something very wise, which I didn't totally grasp the meaning of it until later, when he said, "Because they don't know us." But my first emotion, now that I think about it, have the words to describe it, it was rage. And then later it turned to sadness. And then the third feeling that came about with time was curiosity. Who would say that to another human being? I still don't know, after all these years. This idea of racism, it does not make sense to me. Never will.
The Children's Memorial is going to be significant to Rapid City and our community because we are uncovering this hidden story, and it didn't just happen here in Rapid City, it happened across the country, but we can be one of the first to embrace that story and tell the story of the kids that lived here and that died at the school. But I think that it's really just an opportunity to embrace this story that hasn't been told.
My role in the Lands Project is I'm one of the original historians that collected some of the oral histories and started to put the puzzle together. The Rapid City Indian School opened its doors to a small, handful of families in 1898. The school operated for just over 30 years. By 1930, it was transitioning to serve just children with TB. The federal government started closing these boarding schools during the Depression. So the Rapid City Indian School closed in 1933. TB was rampant and healthcare was segregated. You had a white TB sanatorium in Custer called the Sanator. And then we needed our own TB hospital, Susan, the Rapid City TB Sanatorium. By the 1960s, they were able to treat TB with modern drugs, and it was converted to a clinic to serve our people. It's still operating now. It's Oyate Health Center.
The Rapid City Indian School was actually very similar in its design and purpose and nature to literally hundreds of federal boarding schools and church-run boarding schools across the United States. And the goal was to use Christian conversion and assimilation to try to solve what was widely known at the time as the quote-unquote Indian problem. And the Indian problem was basically simply the fact that across North America, as the United States was going to expand westward, there were native people, indigenous people all across the continent. And it also had enormous economic implications in terms of access to land and water and other kinds of resources that filled tribal lands at that time. And so boarding schools themselves were very deeply integrated into these various kinds of policy decisions.
They acquired 1,200 acres in West Rapid, which was not Rapid City. It was out in the country at the time. They acquired this 1,200 acres for a self-sustaining boarding school. The entire time the school was open, the children got minimal half-day of education, but half a day of manual labor. School was very institutional. It was governed by the bell. The children had very structured lives. They woke up at a certain time. They went to the mess hall. They ate. They marched in formation. They wore garrison caps and military-style uniforms. So it was a very structured, regimented, very foreign concept. These schools were designed to erase our culture, our language, our economy, our laws, everything about who we were and our identity. So it was a very lonely existence.
The goal of the boarding school was to assimilate Native children. And the idea was, if you could take Native people out of their communities, take them away from their families, take them off tribal land, and bring them to these schools, cut their hair, force them to not speak their language, force them to not follow any cultural practices, that you could literally force a Native child to become a white child. Most Native people never received from that process anything better than a version of second-class citizenship. So it was a broken idea to begin with.
My grandmother was born in 1892, and she attended the school about 1904 with her brother, who was only 10 years old. Her brother worked in the fields, which were planted with crops, all in the floodplain by Rapid Creek. And the children were undernourished. They would supplement their diet however they could. And, he pocketed a potato. He wound up bringing this to the boiler room, where there was a terrible explosion, and the boiler went up a whole flight. His body was so charred, they identified him by his shoes. My grandmother was pulled out of school, and he was buried at the Mary Magdalene Cemetery, which is in the Badlands, at 10 years old. Was it preventable? Absolutely. I mean, children were not protected. Their lives meant nothing.
When I was probably 6, around there, I went back to St. Joseph's Indian School. So I couldn't speak English. The only language I knew was Lakota. And there was a lot of other kids like me. And so we talked to each other, in Lakota and all of that. The nuns started punishing us for that. They rubbed bar and soap into my mouth. Real hard. They hold you by your hair like this, and you don't know what they're saying. You don't know what the words come because you don't understand it. When they turn the water on and they're pushing your head towards it, first couple of times it was real scary. The next few times I wanted to get to that water and get the water in my mouth and get that soap out of my mouth because it was all stuck in there, When they're teaching you to read, they're having you repeat English words. If you couldn't say the English words correctly, you were hit. They take your hand and they have a ruler with a metal thing in it. And they hit you across your hands. I have scars here yet. And they hit you until it bled. When we went home from the first year of school, we got off the bus and my grandma said something and I looked at her and I didn't understand her. I looked at my brother, what'd she say? And he said, "Did you forget?" Then he repeated it, "Do you remember?" Then he did it, said it again, and then he said, "Do you remember?" And I remembered. I was scared my grandma was gonna come wash my mouth out with soap. I know she wouldn't do that, but that was my fear for for not understanding her, So that was my experience with that.
Around 2013, Susan was celebrating the 75th anniversary of its existence as a hospital. So not focused so much on the boarding school part of the story, but the hospital side. And while they were doing that, they gave the presentation, and a group of elder Lakota women who had attended the presentation from the Rapid City community came to those folks and said, "What are you going to do about the graves?" And our teammates said, what graves? We didn't know anything about this. And as it turned out, the Native community in Rapid City, primarily the Native women elders from the community had for decades maintained the memory and the stories of a large number of children who died at the school. In some cases, we would later find out whose families were never informed of what happened to them. The story of where they were buried had disappeared. So our project got started simply as an effort to be responsive to this request that we look into what happened to these children.
When we first started looking for the children, there were not a lot of examples. Things have changed pretty dramatically over the last decade, but at the time, we were starting from scratch. And so our first job was to figure out where in the world they might be able to be. And so we had to find the boundaries, the original boundaries of the boarding school, which we knew were beyond what is called Susan, or the hospital campus, which is the former boarding school campus. We spent probably 3 months combing through pages and pages in order to figure out where the original boundaries were. We identified a parcel that was still in federal ownership and had nothing on it. And it was landlocked. And that was odd. Because of these original 1,200 acres that belonged to the boarding school, you can imagine there were a lot of land-hungry people, and pretty much every single inch had been gifted to one entity or another. And so to identify this last remaining federal parcel that was landlocked and had no development on it, but was developed completely around it, made us think that there was a high probability that somebody saved this parcel for a reason when all that land was being allocated. We then began to collect oral histories from either folks who had worked at Susan and had met with elders at one point in time and received their oral histories, or elders that had children or family members that had attended earlier on in its history. We did so carefully as to not indicate our suspicions about where we thought the children might be located. And to the person, they indicated that the bodies were in this location across the street from Susan, where we thought it might be. And so we combined essentially the legal land research with the traditional oral history collection, and that pinpointed where we thought they were most likely to be. We took 2 additional steps. We invited medicine people to come walk the grounds with us to provide their insight, and we met with the tribal historic preservation officers from the tribes in South Dakota, and we invited them to attend. And much later in the oral history process, we obtained an eyewitness oral history confirming that his mother had visited scaffold burials there as well. We also made a promise to these children that we would not forget them. And it was that day and that promise that has kept this project going the entire time.
Hamadak Yapi, Lafanjanisi Machiapi. Thank you for being here this morning. This is our 4th annual Children's Memorial Walk with the Rapid City Indian Boarding School Lands Project. We want to remind everybody that everyone is welcome here. We never want anyone to feel that they cannot join and be a part of this process today.
The Lands Project assembled a team of researchers. It did come up with a pretty comprehensive list of who attended the school, some correspondents who died at the school. To date, we have 50 children that we know died while attending the school.
These children bring us together, who are forgotten by Rapid City for decades, except by our grandmothers. Our Unchis who have done the hard work raising us, molding us, and never allowing us to be forgotten. And with that, today is also known in Rapid City as Unchi Ta Ampetu, the Day of the Grandmothers. All right, so now we're going to start passing out the names. If more children are here, we'd be honored if you would come carry a name of a child. The records were so shoddy that only thing listed was that it was a male and the date of death. So we have male child, 1926. Unnamed child, age unknown, date of death, 1926. Female child number 1, age unknown, date of death 1919. Mark Sherman, Oglala Sioux, age 17, date of death October 16th, 1910. Mark Sherman was hit by a train trying to run away from the Rapid City Indian Boarding School.
So one of our goals with the Rapid City Indian Boarding School Lands Project is to build a children's memorial so that we ensure that their memories stay alive here in our community and that we make sure that we honor them and their families and their place here in Rapid City.
The evolution of the boarding school project, I think, has dramatically outgrown any of our expectations in the beginning. Our goal was to find the children and to honor the requests of the elders in the community. And that took us about 2 years in order to do so, maybe 3. But in the course of doing that research is when we stumbled upon the rest of the Pandora's box of equity and other legal issues that were raised. And so that has sort of snowballed into the multiple projects that we see today. We have an entire memorial park to memorialize the children. We have a project to find equity in some land that was in violation. We have a community development team. We have a community center team. We have an education team. And we've had hundreds of volunteers over the year in different phases of each of those. So that was certainly not anything that we could have imagined or visioned at the time. But this story is so personal to so many people that it provides a really positive outlet to work on the things that everybody think is important to them.
Our responsibilities as Native people and non-Native people is to remember history and knowing the truth of history, no matter where it is. And we know that there are many children that died during the time of being students at the boarding school. 50 have been identified, but we know there are more. They may never be located. And so we need to always keep that in mind, that those little ones, however way they died, however way they felt, we need to honor that and remember it with reverence and respect, which will be created with the Children's Memorial. And knowing that it's going to make a positive impact on our future generations, not just with the Native children and population, but the non-Native people as well.
My daughters know the stories, but they carry who they are, like with grace instead of with trauma. But my daughters are also, from knowing this story, are willing to fight for this story. And that's different too. Our people haven't always been in that position. We've been carrying it, but it's been heavy. And by telling this story and having this memorial and having this place where we talk about it, like my daughters carry it with strength, and they're gonna fight for those kids, and they're gonna keep telling this story. And we have the potential to do that for all of our young people, and it's going to be amazing. You know, they just don't carry the trauma the same way because it's out in the open. We've unpacked it for them.
Tukashila pila maya ye hoye hey hey Tukashila ya mikakuye wanikte Tunkashi